May I leave these things with you? Kendrick asked his father, Silvare, as they sat in the study of the older man's manor on the outskirts of Lashia, the capital city. It was a beautiful spring morning, and the large leaded windows were open to let in the fresh air. In the distance, they could see the ships sailing into Lashia's harbor and hear the low, rhythmic sounds of buoy bells as they rocked with the waves. The silver-haired man looked at his son. What are they? Kendrick sat back heavily in his overstuffed chair, sighed, and said, the results of several years of magical study. If what I suspect is true, things will get very unpleasant in the next few days, and I will need to keep certain items safe. Silvare's baby blue eyes studied his son carefully. He finally asked, Adira has been spending a great deal of time in the palace, has she? Kendrick nodded and said, Lady Talia Pruitt has completed her year as honored consort and is returning to her husband's estate with the child. And you and Adira have been married less than a year, his father said. Damn, I'd hoped the fact that you were such close friends and playmates growing up would have given her pause. King Lanius is a very handsome and persuasive man, Kendrick said. He paused for a moment and chose his words carefully. He did not wish to cast aspersions on the man who'd raised him as his own son, nor did he wish to open any old wounds. I will not stand for it, father. First, he destroyed you and mother, and now he wishes to do it to me. I will not sit in the cuck box, no matter the rewards. If Adira agrees to become his honored consort for this year, then she and I are done. That means being stripped of your title, lands, and fortune, his father said. You managed, Kendrick pointed out. I struck a very carefully worded deal, the first such deal in 500 years, and he swore that it would not happen again. His father then gave him a grim smile, got up and closed the windows to the room, crossed to the door, looked outside it, and then closed it too. He pulled his chair closer to Kendrick's and said in a low whisper, But I have reason to believe that Adira will be the last of the honored consorts. You must choose your path carefully, son. Your mother will be there, as will the rest of the Witches' Council and, of course, the King's Guard and whatever other magical defenses he has around the palace. He will not let you simply walk away. The whole purpose of the honored consort is to humiliate and emasculate the young lords of the kingdom to keep them in line. Furthermore, you will be allowed to bring in neither magic nor weapons. The fact that you are an actual mage already has him worried. He will be on his guard. Kendrick nodded. I don't intend to fight for Adira. If she chooses to become honored consort, it's over between us. I will not take her back. She can have the manor, the valley, and everything that's in it. He smiled wanly and added, or at least what will be left in it. Silvare sat back in his chair and grinned. Your magical research? Like you said, I'm the first of the king's scumsuckers to be an actual mage. Up until you struck your deal, and even afterward, any male mages are either gilded or drowned. I have studied some ancient magics that I came across before Adira and I married. He cocked his head to one side and asked, By the way, how did you manage to keep me alive and intact? Silvare leaned back in his chair and said, I had some help. Lanius and his goddess went too far several decades ago with their plans to cuck as many males as they could. They cucked the wrong person, and he has significant power. He smiled and said, Might I suggest you stop by the Temple of Ceres and leave a substantial offering? Father, Kendrick asked, What are you up to? His father chuckled and said, I've been playing the long game, son. That's all. I can't promise that you won't be hurt when it happens. Most likely, you will be. But if you can endure it, you can set all of Mysteria free from the abomination of the Queen Goddess's son. Kendrick nodded. He knew that he was walking into humiliation, emasculation, and sorrow. He also knew there was a very good chance of violence tonight, and that meant pain and danger. So be it. He would not go quietly into the King's Lord's box, commonly known as the King's Cuck. He loved Adira but would not tolerate what he suspected would come. His manhood, his self-dignity, would not allow it. So, may I leave these things with you? He asked. Of course, his father said. You can put them in your old room. Thank you, father, Kendrick said, rising. One last thing. Yes. Should I fall? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass globe with sigils carved into its surface. Smash this. What is it? His father asked. My final retribution on the king and on Adira for cheating me, he told him. It will make all of Lania's threats meaningless. If I survive, I will recover it from you and move on. You've planned this out? You taught me always to be prepared, Kendrick told him. He reached out and pulled the other man into a deep hug. And one last and most important thing, no matter what happens, no matter what anyone says, you are my father. You always have been and always will be. I love you, father. I know, son. I'm sorry that all of this has happened, Silvare told his tall son. It did not take Kendrick long to take the trunks inside his father's home into his old rooms. To further ensure that they would not be discovered and used against his father, he opened a special door to his realm room and stored everything inside it. It was a small room, 10 yards on each side and high, and in a pocket dimension that could only be opened from his childhood rooms. If he survived, he would move the door to some other place, but for now, this was the safest place for it. After taking his leave from his father, he returned home via the Temple of Ceres. As he climbed down from his coach, he was surprised to see a new priest at the altar. He was a tall, young, very handsome blonde man with piercing blue eyes. Something about the man just seemed to project humility and trust. "How may I help you, Lord Darkane?" the priest asked. Surprised that the man knew his name, he started to mention it but then realized that his coat of arms as the Count Darkane was emblazoned on the door of his coach. "I have come to pray and to make an offering to Ceres," he told the man. He slipped the large ruby ring from his right finger. It had been a gift from King Lanias upon his investment. He saw no better use for it now than to aid in the temple's mission of healing and blessings across Mysteria. Ceres was not a popular deity among his people, the worship of the queen goddess Savet having suppressed the worship of most of her children. Surprised, the priest looked at the ring and said, "This is a kingly gift, my lord. I am sure Ceres will appreciate it. I know the temple will." "You're most welcome," Kendrick said as he knelt at the altar and began to pray for strength, wisdom, and endurance for what he feared would come tonight. It was nearly an hour before he was finished and left the temple. The old high priest, Germain, stopped him at the door, thanked him for the offering, and blessed him. It was well past midday when he arrived home to find Adira awaiting him with a small meal of sweet meat, cheese, fruit, and bread. Adira was a tall, beautiful woman with long red hair and emerald eyes. Her skin was milkmaid fair, and she wore an afternoon dress of pale green. "Where has my husband been this morning?" she asked softly. "I went to visit my father, and then to the temple." He saw no need to lie to her. "Oh," she said quietly, concern on her face. Then, she reached across the table, took his hand, and asked, "Kendrick, you know that I love you with all my heart, don't you?" "I certainly believe so," he replied. "Believe so?" she asked, slightly hurt. "That's all a man can do," he told her. "No man can know a woman's heart for certain. We have been friends since childhood. I've loved you with all my heart since we were old enough to know that there is a difference between men and women. I can only tell you that I love you and trust that you love me too." That seemed to catch her off guard. He noted a small look of pain around her eyes. "I do," she said softly. "No matter what, you are the only man I will ever love." "Thank you," he said, patting her hand. "Now, tell me, have you decided on what to wear to the palace tonight?" "My gold gown, I think," she said as she rose and fetched him a cup of cider from the cooling pantry. "That's a good choice," he told her as she paused in the pantry. "I've always liked you in that gown." Smiling around the door and looking to see if any of the servants were listening, she said, "You've always liked me out of it more." He smiled and cocked an eyebrow at her. "We could always go upstairs, and I can take you out of the one you are wearing now." She shook her head and said, "No, I've got too many things to do before tonight." She brought him the flagon of cider and sat it on the table before him. "Here's something to cool your blood until tonight." Picking up the flagon, he felt a tingle go through his hand. Glancing in the cup, he saw small swirls of something dark in the amber liquid. The image of a mountain ash suddenly swam before his eyes. With an abundance of caution, he raised the flagon to drink but did not let the liquid touch his lips. Setting it down, he smiled and lied, "That's a particularly good batch this year." His wife smiled at him again and said, "So you've said before. Now finish it and see your valet for what you need tonight." Now, on high alert, he nodded and cast a quick evaporation spell on the flagon before pretending to quaff the last of it. His heart broke at the thought that his wife would go so far as to poison or drug him. Rising from the table, he told her, "I'll see Tomas in a little while. There are things I need to do in my tower." "Kendrick?" she asked softly. He could see something in her eyes. Was it regret? He couldn't tell. "Yes. Don't get lost in your work. We do have a royal summons, you know." "I know," he told her, keeping his face as neutral as possible as he turned to go. "And Kendrick?" "Yes," he asked without turning. "I love you." "So you say," he told her and left the room, his heart breaking from the cheating he felt. Arriving in his workroom, he considered what had just happened. He'd caught a hint of sandalwood and orange scents in that cider, which he knew had no place there. It was also the scent of a black wool potion, a draft that would render a will worker unable to access their magic for 24 hours. He could not believe that his wife would be that willing of a participant in a scheme to humiliate and cuck him publicly. He realized that likely there would be other attempts to counteract his magic at the ball tonight. He was walking into a pit of vipers, and his wife writhing among them. Briefly, he considered fleeing and washing his hands of everything. Not only his pride, but also his sense of justice would not allow that. He had to let this play out. He had to be sure that his wife, the love of his life, was going to cheat him. He had no doubts about the king who was his biological father, and his ability to cheat Kendrick. Racking his brains, trying to come up with a plan so as to not eat or drink anything tonight or to accept anything on his person. All he could do was prepare certain contingency spells and have them at the ready. Picking up a small velvet bag from his workbench gave him an idea. He could not enchant it just yet because the witches that would be there would detect it. But he could prepare it for his needs, so he only had to cast the final spell to make it work. His biggest fear, however, was the blood majesty that his mother and King Lanius could invoke on him. The will-working child of will-workers could be forced to obey by the power of the blood that they shared with their parents. If they invoked that, it would become a battle of wills. Kendrick knew his will to be strong, but he knew the same of his mother and of the king. The latter had the divine blood of the queen goddess flowing through his veins, unfiltered by a human mother as he was. All he could do was say a prayer to Ceres and hope that the blessings he received today would be of some help. He did not see AITA again until they were getting into the coach for the journey to the palace. Her beautiful golden gown accentuated her features with a neckline that was just barely within the boundaries of good taste. Her hair was worn up in an elegant configuration to show off a new set of emerald earrings. "Where did you get those?" he asked. She blushed deeply and reached up to touch the teardrop-shaped gems inset in gold and said, "They were a gift from King Lanius. He asked that I wear them tonight." "I see," he told her, sitting back in his seat. "Then tonight, you are planning to become an honored consort." "Oh, Kendrick," she said, reaching across the aisle and taking his hand. "You know I love you. You know that this is only for a year. If you love me, you'll let me do this." "Let you do it? Do I have a choice in the matter?" he asked. She looked down and said, "You know you don't. The king has chosen me. Only if you're willing to accept it," he said. "Why wouldn't I want to accept it?" she asked. "When the year ends, we will raise the king's child for his position among the nobles. Your own title and lands will be increased, and my manhood and self-respect smashed to pieces." He paused and added, "And I will be diminished in your eyes as a lesser man as well. You would condemn whatever children we might have later to losing my title and lands because they will all go to the king's scumsucker. I think I would rather die." "Don't say that, Kendrick," she replied sharply. "Like you said, you don't have a choice." "But you do," he told her. "You can reject the position. It's been done before. And those women live out their lives forever banished from the palace and proper society. So your position in society is more important to you than my self-respect and dignity?" "I didn't say that," she retorted. "If you do this, AITA, you won't have a home to return to. I will never take you back. I will never touch you again. And you'll be stripped of your lands and title and given to me to hold in regency for the child I will bear the king." She shook her head and said, "You will be reduced to nothing, a landless beggar wandering Mysteria." Kendrick took a deep breath and said, "You're walking very close to a line that once crossed, you will never be able to cross back, AITA. You say you love me, but you want to hurt me in the worst way a woman can ever hurt a man. I will not forgive this. I'm going to ask you one last time, and then whatever decision you make will be up to you. I'm asking you not to do this to me." She shook her head, nearly in tears. "I can't change my mind, Kendrick. The cost will be too high. I do love you. I love you with all my heart and want to grow old with you." "No, you don't, AITA. If you did, you wouldn't do this. And no, you won't grow old with me. We are done when you do this. You have broken my heart, and it cannot be mended. Even now, at the thought of you even wanting to do this, my love for you dies. Your male pride will eventually get over it, Kendrick. And if it doesn't," he asked. "Then, you are not the man I thought I married," she said smugly. "Nor are you the woman I thought loved me," he told her sharply. They rode the remaining distance to the palace in silence, AITA lost in her own thoughts, and Kendrick staring out the window, wondering how he could have chosen so poorly for a wife. An hour later, he was at the palace. The Comte d'Arcane and Lady AITA, the king's chamberlain, announced Kendrick and AITA as they entered the main ballroom. It was a huge marbled room with vaulted ceilings that had mosaics of the queen goddess inlaid in semi-precious stones. Equally exquisite was the statuary around the room. A dozen soldiers were carved from granite with such fine detail that the viewer could see individual strands of hair. They all stood silent guard around 3 long tables set up in the room, 2 along each row of columns on either side and a third one perpendicular to them with the king and his chosen retinue at it. Kendrick noted that the table to his right consisted of the king's lords, and the one on the left consisted of everyone else. King Lanius was dressed all in white trimmed in gold. Rings with precious gems inset adorned his arms, and his belt was of beaten gold. He was a tall, well-muscled, handsome man with blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to glow slightly and was watching Kendrick with a knowing smirk. Kendrick could feel every eye on him. He knew that everyone in the vast ballroom saw him as tonight's entertainment and his marriage and love, the latest sacrifice to the queen goddess Yvette's perverted pleasure. Well, he planned on making it at least entertaining for them. He took a deep breath and walked down the steps to the main floor, where 2 servants awaited them. The first took Adira's hand and led her to the king's table. The second took him by the elbow and indicated that he should follow him. When he saw the table awaiting him was that of the king's lords, he stopped. "I don't think so." He noted the pitying looks of the other guests. "Don't make a scene, Count d'Arcane," the guard nearby said quietly so that only he could hear. "You must accept the king's will." It was then that Kendrick decided that he had enough of this charade. He threw the first part of his initial plan away, deciding to strike while the iron was hot. These people wanted to be entertained by his cucking. Then, he was going to give them something to remember. He shook his head, stood tall, and stopped in his tracks before saying loud enough so that every ear in the room could hear him, "I do not consent to this." A shock of surprise ran through the room. "You have not been granted permission to address the gathering, Count d'Arcane," King Lanius said as he stood. "To what do you not consent?" "To become a king's lord, to my wife becoming your honored consort, and to being publicly humiliated." Lanius laughed and said, "You are skipping the best part of the festivities, d'Arcane. You will deny my guests their meal and their entertainment." "I will waste neither the king's time nor mine," Kendrick said. "Is it your plan to make my wife your honored consort?" He asked the question, the answer to which everyone in the room already knew. "You forget yourself, d'Arcane," Lanius said. Then with a broad, vicious smile, he said, "But yes, I plan on making your wife my honored consort for a year, siring a child upon her and sending her and the child home for you to raise as befitting his or her status." He looked to where his wife was nearly crying and asked, "Adira, do you consent to the king's plan?" With a sniffle, she said, "Kendrick, don't." "Do you?" he barked. Finally, wiping her tears, she said, "I consent." "Then we are done. You are no longer my wife." "I'm leaving," he said, turned on his heel, and started toward the door. He noted that the king's witches started toward the entrance, where the doors suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang. "You do not have my permission to withdraw, d'Arcane," the king said as he began to stride forward. Without warning, Kendrick struck. 3 quick wide area 11 blasts dropped 6 witches instantly. They crumpled to the floor, their bodies smoking from the power of the bolts. He heard a gasp come from the room and saw his mother's shocked face. She turned toward Adira and asked, "You little fool, didn't you give him the potion?" "I did," his wife protested. "I watched him drink it." That was all Kendrick needed to hear. He struck again. This time, the bolt that struck his mother rendered her paralyzed and frozen in place. He turned to face the quickly advancing King Lanius, who screamed, "You are out of order, d'Arcane." Kendrick gestured toward the floor, and the whole room shook as a marble wall 2 feet thick and 10 feet high running from table to table rose up between him and the king. The effect shook the room, dumping food, drink, and serving places all over the floor. The nobles in the room gasped in shock and ran for the back wall to escape the coming battle. Kendrick heard Lanius' voice command, "Sentries, contain him." To Kendrick's horror, several of the large statues he had noted before came to life, and with a grinding noise that set his teeth on edge, they moved with remarkable speed and agility. 2 of them leaped from their alcoves in the wall to land within 5 feet of him, cracking the marble floor underneath their mass. Without hesitation, he pushed back against the wall behind him and forward with a force bolt. The effort nearly crushed him between them, as the statues skidded backward along the floor, leaving deep gouges and cracks. That wouldn't do. He didn't have the quintessence to move several tons at a time for a protracted conflict. Instead, he called upon a spell he used to dig out the basement of his manor to expand his cider stores. With a gesture, he blasted out with a burrowing magic. A wave of cyclonic energy projected from his hand toward the 2 statues. It hit them like a battering ram, shattering them into pebbles, and continued along its path for another 100 feet, cutting a neat hole through the wall next to the sealed doors. Hearing more grating sounds to his left and right, he turned in a circle, hurling the burrowing spell at the statues as they closed with him and coincidentally cutting huge holes in the walls of the ballroom and taking out the occasional support for the vaulted ceiling. Then it all went to hell. The wall behind him shattered into a million shards as an enraged Lanige charged through it. As the wall fell, Kendrick could see the gathered nobles cowering in a far corner, fear and uncertainty in their eyes. He noted that one man, Lord Pruitt, the newest member of the King's Lords, sat unmoving at his table, smiling and chuckling. From the corner of his eye, he saw Adira cowering and crying at the king's table, terrified at what was happening. Kendrick raised a quick shield to protect himself from the shrapnel that was hurtling toward him. The shield stopped the sharp pieces of marble but did nothing to slow down Lanige. He caught Kendrick with a powerful punch to the stomach, lifting the young man off his feet and hurling him backward toward the door, knocking the wind from him. Kendrick struggled to regain his breath as he raised a quick and dirty shield that the king managed to shatter with a single punch, sending Kendrick back into the steps. He felt his ribs break under the blow. Then came more strikes, breaking ribs, shattering his jaw, and dislocating his shoulder. Pain lanced through his body with each divinely powered attack. Then he simply stopped feeling the hits. Finally, Lanige picked him up by the throat and said, "Good plan, boy. Too bad you didn't have the power to pull it off." Kendrick struggled to escape, but the king's grip was too powerful. With contemptuous ease, he turned Kendrick around and held him by the back of the neck, his feet dangling 6 inches from the floor, and his voice boomed throughout the hall. "Behold, Adira Darkane, your husband, pitiful as he is, beaten and broken." He smiled cruelly and said, "But I am a merciful king and will not kill him." Yet, he nodded to 2 of the servants who came and took Kendrick under the shoulders. "Hold him for a moment. Then, take him to Count Darchambeau's tower. Cuff him, and then call for the healer to attend his wounds." When the servants had taken control of Kendrick, he strode across the room to Adira and offered his arm to her. "Let him see." Kendrick felt one of the servants take him by the hair and hold his head up to face the king as Adira took Linea's arm and was led away sobbing. Then, the darkness took Kendrick. Kendrick ached all over as he swam up from unconsciousness into a world of pain. Slowly opening his eyes to a bright light shining through a window, he tried to roll over, but his ribs protested with extreme zeal, so he lay his head back on the pillow. Attempting to ascertain where he was and how he got there, he looked around at a well-apportioned room. He could hear the sounds of the palace from his window. Then it all came rushing back to him. The fight in the ballroom and the beating he'd received. Then his heart broke at the memory of Adira following Lanius out of the room. "Kendrick," he heard Adira's voice. Kendrick clenched his teeth and tried to will the tears from his eyes. He felt her hand on his forehead and jerked his head to the side to avoid her touch. His vision swam, and his stomach lurched at the sudden movement. "Don't touch me," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Kendrick," she repeated. This time it was a statement. "Go away," he told her. "I never want to see or hear of you again. You've polluted yourself. You're no wife of mine. Kendrick, Lanius says that he will forgive you if you take me back at the end of the year and raise the child. If you don't, he'll kill you. Then so be it. You've befouled yourself, and I will not submit." "Kendrick," he swore to make Silvari watch, she said. "Please don't do that to him." "Why should you care?" he said. "You cheated my father as much as you cheated me. You knew what would happen and accepted, not caring how much it would hurt me. Now go away and don't come back. You're unclean and not fit for any decent man. You're Lania's woman now, not my wife." She nodded, tears flowing freely down her face. "I'm sorry. You've got a year here in the tower to decide." "I've already made my decision," he told her. "You are nothing to me. My life is nothing to me. Your lands," she said. "They'll go to the child." Kendrick chuckled bitterly. "What's left of them, at least," he told her. What have you done, Kendrick?" she asked, worry in her voice. "Wouldn't you like to know? Now leave. You have nothing to say that I want to hear." "I'm sorry," she said as she left the room. Kendrick turned toward the wall and wept until sleep retook him. He had no idea how long he slept. It had to be at least through the rest of the day, as it was dark when he awoke again. This time, the pain wasn't quite so intense, and he could stumble out of bed and use the chamber pot. When he finished, he noted that there was a plate of food and a pitcher of water on the table. As he reached for the pitcher, he saw some kind of silver cuff on his right arm that ran from his wrist to his elbow. Active magic sigils decorated its surface, and he could feel their magic pushing against his. Reaching for the pitcher, he sniffed the water but could not detect any odor besides the water itself. He ran his hand above the pitcher for a detect poison spell. The backlash from the spell rebounding surged through his arm like a levin bolt, hurling him back onto the bed. What in Cirrus' name? He cursed. Looking at the cuff, he realized what it was. Any attempt to direct magic out of his body would rebound and stun him. Lanius was taking no chances. He'd neutralized Kendrick's greatest strength, his magic. Shaking his head, he realized that he had no choice. If the food and water were or were not be poisoned, his only options were to eat or starve. He felt Lanius wasn't yet done with him and would not want to poison him, so he took the first choice. The food was bland but filling, but he felt somewhat refreshed after consuming it. When he was done, he went to the window and looked out. Much to his surprise, it looked directly into a suite of rooms. Then, he saw Adira readying herself for bed as Lanius entered the room. He understood now. This room was meant to make the prisoner witness his cucking. He reached to close the window but found it locked in the open position. Refusing to watch, he returned to his bed and tried to drown out the sounds coming across the intervening space between the rooms. It was close to dawn when Lanius finally left Adira's room, and he was able to get to sleep. Sleep, however, was not to be allowed, as within the hour, 2 guards came crashing into the room and dragged him from his bed. Roughly, he was stripped of his clothing, tied to a chair sitting by the window, and left there. The sun had climbed above the rooftops of the palace by the time a middle-aged man entered the room with 2 guards. "The torture is to begin now," he asked. The man was tall, with a hawk-like nose and gray eyes. He was dressed all in black and silver with a short cloak. He looked to the window and shook his head before turning to the guards. "If the king wants him alive, then it's not a good idea to leave him in the draft naked. Close that window." "But the king wants him to watch the other chambers," the guard protested. "Neither the Lady Adira nor His Majesty are currently in those chambers." "Close the window. You can open it again tonight for the king's entertainment. For now, I'd prefer not to add a cold to Darkane's injuries." The guard nodded, withdrew a strange key from his belt, applied it to the base of each window, and then closed them before withdrawing to the other side of the room. When he took up his post, the man gave him a withering look and said, "Outside." The guard made to protest, but another withering look from the strange man, and he left and closed the door. He turned to Kendrick and said, "My lord Darkane, I am AITA Debrio. I am the royal healer. I'm here to check over your wounds and how you are healing. And I must be stripped naked and tied to a chair for this?" Kendrick asked. "It is a precaution for my safety. Count Darchambeau attacked and killed his first healer when given the chance." "I see," Kendrick said. "Are you allowed to answer questions?" "I am," Debrio told him. "Would you like to know? How long have I been in this tower?" "Nearly a week," the man said. "You were in quite a sorry state when I was brought here. You had a broken jaw, several broken ribs, and severe internal injuries. I had a bit of a time healing you. His Majesty was not kind to you. And now, you are mostly recovered. I don't know if that is due to my healing abilities or your own remarkable recuperative powers. A lesser man would have died," he told Kendrick. "I'm afraid that your healing and my recuperative abilities are all for naught." Kendrick told him, "Oh, I have been informed that if I don't relent by the end of Adira's term as honored consort, I'm to be executed and my father forced to watch. I will not submit. A year is a long time, Lord Darkane, and life is precious," Debrio told him. "You may find something for which to live over the next year. I've spoken with the Lady Adira. She is genuinely sorry that this has happened to you," the healer told him. "She seems to love you very much." Kendrick shook his head and said, "She's no lady, nor does she love me. She could have refused the dubious honor and spared us all. Instead, she valued her place in the palace society over me and my love. She's as dead to me as I will be when the year is up." Debrio shook his head and said, "Let's hope you choose not to undo all of my hard work at the end of the year." He sat back and asked, "In the meantime, is there anything I can get you? A key to this cuff and a sharp sword?" he asked. Shaking his head, the healer answered, "I'm afraid those things are out of my ability to supply. I can arrange for books, certain foods, or even a game for lances and crowns." "No, thank you," he told Debrio. "Very well. I will have the guards untie you and bring in for you some fresh clothing, lady. Your wife had brought from your home, and a bath." "Thank you," Kendrick said. "I do appreciate your efforts. Please think about what I said. Life is precious, and your wife is young and foolish. I believe she loves you." "Believe what you wish," Kendrick told him. "I know what I know. She didn't love me enough and has killed my love for her." "As you wish," Debrio told him as he left the room. True to his words, the guards returned momentarily with the instruments for a bath and a new set of clothing for him. He slipped the bag he prepared from his old clothes and held onto it for reasons he did not understand. He couldn't charge the spells, but it might be helpful later. As his mind began to consider ways of charging the bag's spells and possible uses, he felt a tiny spark of something ignite in his soul. It wasn't quite yet hope, but it was something. Fortunately, for the first month, Lanius seemed content that Kendrick being forced to listen to his nightly sessions with Adira was enough torture. That gave him some time to consider his position and his options. All he could really do was watch for patterns and look for some way out of his cell. On several occasions, he'd attempted to remove the cuff and had gotten a 11-bolt directed up close and personal for his troubles. He received his first new visitor at the beginning of his second month of imprisonment. To his surprise, the guards opened his cell one morning to admit the young priest he'd met at the Temple of Ceres. The man was tall, handsome, and somewhat youngish, with blonde hair and intense blue eyes. He was wearing a priest's mantle and carried a book, a small wooden box, and a sprig of mountain ash with him. He smiled at Kendrick and bowed slightly before saying, "My name is Lucian, and my master has sent me to see to your spiritual needs, Count D'Arcane." Kendrick raised an eyebrow and said, "I am surprised I'm to be allowed such comfort." He nodded toward the window, and with his head. Lucian gave him a mischievous smile and said, "My master's will is paramount, my lord." "Please," Kendrick said, gesturing to a chair across the small table from the one he'd been tied to weeks ago, "sit down. I'm afraid I cannot offer you the hospitality of my home." The young man nodded and said, "I'm glad your spirit has not been completely crushed, my lord. I have come to keep you company for an hour or so." He raised the small box. "Perhaps play a few games of lances and crowns, and maybe lift your spirits with tales of the gods, in which you might find some inspiration." Kendrick found himself genuinely glad for the man's company. He discovered that he craved human companionship beyond just the guards who delivered his food and his weekly instruments of bathing. "Thank you." He gestured toward the table and said, "How about a game?" The priest smiled and set up the board for them to play, telling him, "I must warn you that I'm an excellent player." Kendrick smiled and told him, "Then I'm probably in for a trouncing as I'm middling at best." True to his word, the priest won the first game easily. As they set up for a second game, Lucian said, "If I may be so bold, my lord, your situation reflects something similar among the gods. A tale that is not regularly told in the kingdom of Bredain as it is prohibited by the goddess queen's control of the court." "Oh?" Kendrick asked, genuinely intrigued. It was no secret that Zavet strictly controlled what the other temples could teach. "I'm unaware of such a tale. Few are, even outside of the kingdom, as it is extremely embarrassing to Lord Ceres. But I think it is a story in which you can find comfort." "Please tell me," Kendrick said, if for no other reason than to pass the time. The young man blushed before saying, "Very well. In the days before the founding of Bredain, the gods walked among mortals and lived in relative peace. The Lord Ceres, being the youngest of Zavet's children, was the last of his brothers to take a wife. As you know, Zavet only bore male children, so the 7 brothers were forced to look to the gods of other lands for wives. Most went to the gods of the Western Isles, for their mother goddess was fertile and had many sons and daughters. Deals were made, gifts were exchanged, alliances were forged, wives wooed, and marriages obtained." "Okay, that's pretty standard for what is taught in all 8 temples," Kendrick told him as he moved his chevalier onto the board. "Yes, but the story of Ceres, the youngest brother, is not generally taught. Ceres could not find a wife among the young goddesses of the Western Isles that were to his liking or he to them. So he traveled farther afield, looking for more than a wife, but a partner and a companion. He had seen how his brothers and his sisters-in-law treated each other and wanted something different, something more, something closer. So, where did he go?" Kendrick asked as Lucian moved a pikeman to intercept his chevalier. "Far away," Lucian told him. "Beyond the stars, to a world so far away that its light has never reached the skies of Mysteria." "I'm not sure I understand," Kendrick replied in confusion. In an attempt at a trompier, he moved his chevalier 2 squares to the right and smiled. "It is so far away that we cannot see it from Mysteria," Lucian said. "Or so I've been told." Lucian moved his chateau to block Kendrick's chevalier in a move that caught Kendrick off guard, rendering his opening gambit a failure. It was a beginner's mistake. And what did he find there? The most beautiful goddess he'd ever seen. Her name was Ithia, and she was the youngest daughter of the god king, Rio, and his wife, Kala. The two fell almost instantly in love. They fit each other perfectly in personality, appearance, and in their dreams for the future. Sirius eventually received Rio's blessings for a union on the condition that Sirius take his daughter far from their world. This stipulation confused the young gods, but they agreed and left Rio's world with many great gifts and blessings, and a few lesser gifts that were of equal importance to their future. With Ithia's parents' blessings, they traveled to Mysteria. I've heard whispered curses about Ithia from Zevet's priests. She is not well liked by the Queen Goddess's church. Lucian studied the board before him momentarily, and Kendrick could almost see the wheels turning inside the young priest's mind. Finally, he moved his shadow directly in front of Kendrick's Regis. The events that came later made her very unpopular with Zevet, and trust me, the feeling is mutual between them. Sometimes, I wonder if the only reason that Ithia remains at Sirius' side is because she has nowhere else to go. I don't understand, Kendrick said, realizing that the same statement applied to Lucian's unnecessary move and his comment about Ithia. It's part of the tragic tale, Lucian told him as Kendrick moved his own cardinal to take Lucian's chateau. Lucian raised an eyebrow at the surprising move. It would seem that something about the tale put the young priest off his game. Please continue, Kendrick told him as Lucian studied the board and rubbed his beardless chin. The two young gods returned to Mysteria and set up housekeeping in the High Realm. Sirius built for his bride a high mansion in a broad valley with a river running through it. He blessed the land and placed all sorts of fantastic creatures and plants within it for her enjoyment. Finally, Lucian moved his Regis to the square his chateau had previously occupied and began plotting his game anew. It was Kendrick's turn to study the board, and he decided that should Lucian move one of his pikemen, his Regis would threaten Kendrick's Regis. He moved a cardinal diagonal to it so that should Lucian take his Regis, he could take the priest Regis. A stalemate where they would both lose their most powerful piece. That sounds idyllic so far. It was. The couple lived in peace and love for nearly a year until Zevet decided that it was time to exert her authority over her son and his new bride. How? Much in the same way as has happened to you. The only difference was that Ithia was not given a choice. Zevet placed the couple in a deep sleep and bound them to their bed. She awoke them and explained that they should understand she was the undisputed master of the High Realm and of their lives, and that they were allowed to exist as they were only by her choice. Neither Sirius nor Ithia would have disagreed with her, but she said that she must make them understand this under no uncertain terms. She transformed into a great hulking man and took Ithia in their bed while Sirius was forced to watch helplessly. When Zevet had completed her task, she changed back and left. Lucian sighed, and Kendrick saw something in his eyes that was very nearly heartbreaking. It took nearly a week before the bonds were loosened, and the two could escape. They cleaned themselves up, comforted each other, and started making plans. They would not let this stand. They charged the gates of Zevet's palace. The battle shook the High Realm as foolishly. Zevet had never taken the young goddess's measure, and it was much more than she had expected. Ithia laid waste to nearly the entirety of Zevet's domain, and only the intervention of the other 6 brothers stayed their hands. That certainly has never been mentioned by the church here in Bretagne, Kendrick told him. No, I doubt it would be. Lord Sirius discovered that each of his brothers had experienced the same thing and that it had soured their marriages. Ithia and Sirius decided that they would not allow that to happen to them. Instead, they appealed to Ithia's father for help, and then they discovered why Rio wanted his daughter far from their homeworld. It had been destroyed, and their followers incinerated when their sun blew up. In their state of weakness, from the loss of the entirety of their followers, they were picked off by other pantheons and destroyed. Sending Ithia away had been her parents' play to save her from that fate. What did they do? They returned home, only to discover that Ithia was with child by Zevet's assault. Sirius destroyed his valley in the High Realm and moved his family to a secret location that none of the other gods could find. Ithia's daughter was born, and Sirius raised the girl as his own with great love and tenderness, never telling her how she was conceived. The enmity between him and his mother never healed. Eventually, Bretagne was founded. Zevet took the first king as a lover and bore him a son.